Thank you. So I wanted to let everyone know that we're going to primarily engage in a bit of a conversation. Jane and I are going to talk this out and share some historical moments and some vignettes and some anecdotes and some context for all of you. But I think Rabbi Jane wanted to start us off by situating us in the moment in time where we are specifically today. So Rabbi Jane.
Today is Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. This is a wonderful day to talk about gay families because the issue of the existential, of what Fackenheim called the 614th commandment, which is the imperative of post-Shoah Jews to have children, became a major issue in LGBTQ liberation in the Jewish community. And that a form of social pressure from within and internal social pressure from without and internal pressure from within, the whole issue of families and creating families became a core issue. And we're going to actually start with that.
Yeah, so when you looked at the title, you saw something about a gay or queer death drive and probably wondered, what are we referencing? So that's expressly in this context of post-Holocaust anxiety in Jewish communities around the world, but in the US as much as anywhere, over the continuation of Jewish peoplehood, the continuation of Jewish life, and this fear that the decimation of Jewish populations, which was so recent in the Holocaust, had maybe been a sort of forceful death knell or death blow to Jewish continuity in the world. So in the late 1960s, so just 20 years after the end of World War II, but also keep in mind the full recognition of the force and scale and scope of the Holocaust didn't really become fully clear to most people until the 1960s. So when we're talking about voices of the late 60s, it's even shortly the idea that of the level of demographic and cultural impact and trauma of the Holocaust was newly being discussed. So it is in the late 60s that gay and lesbian people are becoming newly and increasingly visible in American society, even before the Stonewall Rebellion of June 1969, which we often consider sort of the official spark of the modern gay rights movement. But it had actually been going on for some time before that, and rabbis and Jewish leaders around the country were noticing, and they were calling attention to this and decrying what they saw as a potential threat to the Jewish community if gay and lesbian visibility in American society would lead to gay and lesbian visibility in Jewish communities. So I'll give you some examples of specific individuals who were making claims about this. So Rabbi Norman Lamb, who some of you might know, was for many years the dean of Yeshiva University and one of the most well-known Orthodox rabbis in the country, already in 1968 had written, quote, "The fulcrum of Jewish life and continuity has always been the family, and it's the family that is the first victim of moral delinquency." And here he's referring to homosexuality as the great moral delinquent threat to the Jewish family. He felt that homosexuality, and this was his language, he was using the word homosexuality as opposed to gay and lesbian, homosexuality was antithetical to reproduction. And the major purpose of sexuality in his mind was reproduction. And the major purpose of the Jewish family was reproduction, right? Going back to the very first positive commandment in the Torah, in the book of Genesis, be fruitful and multiply, considered a core religious obligation of Jewish men. Interestingly, not an obligation of Jewish women, although of course it takes two to tango there. But in terms of Jewish law, Jewish women are not the ones legally required to ensure that that takes part in their lives. In any case, so he was seeing gay people as a dangerous threat. And again, in the context of the Holocaust, all the more so than might have been maybe had this conversation happened 20 or 30 years prior. And he wasn't the only one. So, there were other people making charges that the gay people were anti-family, anti-procreation, that they represented a death drive. And that's where that phrase comes from, this idea that the actual death, the destruction of Jewish continuity, the death and destruction of the Jewish family. Just to give you two more examples, and then I'll hand things over to Jane for some responses. The neoconservative columnist Will Herberg, who some of you might be aware of, had written in 1969 that homosexuality represented perversion, corruption, deviance, vice, sickness. Note all the linking of those things, by the way, sickness as well as perversion. But that heterosexuality, and here's the best part, was, and this is a quote, a death-defying act. So although he didn't explicitly call homosexuality or gay and lesbian people a death cult or a death drive, he was expressly suggesting that anything that was not part of the heterosexual impulse towards Jewish reproduction and Jewish continuity was therefore a death drive, because heterosexuality, in his words, was a death-defying act. And, you know, lest you think, and I'll give you one more example, just lest you think that this might only have been the kind of rhetoric coming from people like Norman Lamb, you know, a modern Orthodox rabbi, or Will Herberg, a well-known neoconservative. Rabbi Eugene Borowitz of the Reform Movement's Hebrew Union College had actually once, in a speech in 1971, said, quote, "Judaism is not a religion of the present. It's future-oriented. That's why parents go nutty over kids. It's directed towards the coming of the Messiah. It's the only way to ensure that Jews will be around waiting for the Messiah." And then he went on to say that gay people, and specifically he was referencing homosexual marriage, which is sort of a long story of why he was concerned about that even in 1971, gay people would shift Jews off that path. So this idea that Judaism is about futurity, that Judaism is about leaning into the future through creating family, through creating children, through passing on Jewish traditions from generation to generation, and that gay people, who were then understood as people who would by definition not have children, right, were a core and existential threat. Jane, some comments or additions to that?
Well, I think that one of the profound pieces of that is how internalized that was within the LGBTQ community, and that I think many gay men and lesbian women who are basically what we were looking at in the late 60s and early 70s felt that they would never be able to have children, and that it was a great loss. And out of that feeling of loss and isolation and alienation from the Jewish community, I think part of that was the impulse, or that was the engine that started to promote the idea of alternative families and alternative constructions of familial ties and intimacy, so that gay people started to look at each other as familial people. You know, when I was a rabbinic student early on, working in that way, I found that even despite all of this, that when I counseled interfaith couples, it still was much more likely that the non-Jewish partner would have been thrown out by the family and would be not accepted at all. And so I think in the gay and lesbian Jewish community, there was a sort of double message, which was, you know, we're not going to throw you out entirely, but you're not, you know, you're not doing what you should be doing. And there was a lot of pressure to start to do things differently. And I think the first gay synagogues and the small gay groups were organized out of that feeling of needing family, of wanting family, and of looking for family. And it wasn't too long before family started to show up. So as you and I have discussed, really by the 70s, people who had been gay men and lesbian women who had been in heterosexual marriages, who had children from those marriages, started to bring the children into the community, particularly among lesbians. There was a big push to integrate children into the burgeoning gay Jewish community.
So I think that shift, and there's this sort of period where both are going on simultaneously, that people are using LGBT synagogues and other Jewish queer space as exactly as you described, as ways to kind of create what's called chosen family, connecting with people in ways that reflect the intimacy, the emotional ties, the commitment, and sharing that one finds in what we normatively presume to be family, but without necessarily having any biological or even legal ties with each other. And actually in those congregations in those early years, the rhetoric, the language of family was surfacing constantly, right? Even though they expressly didn't mean people having children, they meant exactly these ties of chosen family. They're surfacing in the liturgy, they're surfacing in the newsletters, they're surfacing in the sermons. People just use that language constantly. And Jewish queer people weren't the only folks doing this. This is sort of a common way of understanding the development of gay and lesbian community in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But exactly, there are these small numbers of individuals who do have children, and as you mentioned, generally lesbians. And the reason why it's generally lesbians is in part that the few men who might also have had children through previous heterosexual relationships were generally denied any custody. So they had often little or even no connection on a day-to-day basis with their children, in part because of societal expectations from that era that men who are not in some kind of sort of familial or relationship context with a woman are somehow a core threat to children or incapable of raising children. But it's also, illegal in some states for a man to have custody, right? These in that kind of context. Well, he's a gay man. That's a problem. Remember, it's still considered a psychological disorder until 1973, right? So
right. And even if they were allowed custody, sometimes it was under the rules that they couldn't have their lover around, or they couldn't mention the word gay, or they certainly couldn't take the child to a gay synagogue or a gay Shabbat gathering or anything like that. And that was true for women too, that there were all sorts of restrictions put around joint custody arrangements. So it made it harder for people who had children to integrate those children into a Jewish gay space. But, go ahead.
Yeah, so then gradually though, what starts to shift the conversation is the beginning of queer people, lesbians and gay men, first mostly lesbians, choosing to have children and not coming to the gay Jewish space, gay Jewish synagogue, by having children from a previous episode or previous era in their life when they weren't yet maybe living out their full lesbian or bisexual identity, but starting to say, we want to have children by choice. So if you want to talk about that, because I think you probably
I was there, right?
You were there, right? Both Jane and I have been around for a while, and both of us. One thing that's worth sharing about this is both of us have been part of these moments and these movements for a very long time and have some notable overlap. Jane was around for them a little bit longer than me, so I'll let you talk about those moments.
So, particularly I think in terms of lesbian, bisexual women, the feminist movement created a choice for lesbianism, if you will. Like Adrienne Rich, who was Jewish, talks about compulsory heterosexuality, and how people, if you look at a Kinsey scale, which I'm not a big fan of, but I'm just going to use for now. If you look, you say there's people who are really internally very identified as homosexual. And then there's a bunch of people who are very heavily identified as heterosexual. And then there's a bunch of people who are what she called compulsory heterosexual, who are socialized without knowing it in every way into heterosexuality without realizing that there's even an option. And the feminist movement, for good and for bad, gave women an opportunity to ease the strictures of compulsory heterosexuality and see if indeed they could find a love relationship, a romantic relationship, and a sexual relationship with another woman, and sort of confront that idea that every girl has to be Barbie and every boy has to be Ken. So there was this burgeoning of lesbian identity in the 70s, and along with it came a lot of self-empowerment. Do your own everything. And so there were feminist women's clinics where women would give each other self exams, and a lot more understanding of how our bodies ourselves, how women's bodies, women's genitals functioned. And in terms of reproductive technology, the earliest, we take that sort of for granted now, but it wasn't in the 70s. And the earliest kinds of reproductive technology for women that was on a do-yourself basis were called turkey baster babies. And a number of women I knew, used that method of a turkey baster, and a male friend who provided the genetic material and had children. I particularly remember a lesbian couple when I was in graduate school. And so I was probably in my early 20s, and this lesbian couple who were maybe 5 years older than me, or maybe a little, somewhat older than me, 28, probably 29, had this turkey baster baby, probably one of the very, very earliest ones. And he was now 12, which was very, very unusual in our Jewish lesbian community. And he was like hungry all the time. And his mothers just ate salads, right? And he just was starving. And so I would come over to his house to tutor him in Hebrew, and I would bring him bags of ho-hos and ding-dongs. And we would hide the contraband under his bed so that he could have something to eat at night.
And bring up on ding-dongs and salad.
Exactly.
And many of these grassroots do-it-yourself women's and feminist health organizations, such as the Boston Women's Health Collective that created the Our Bodies Ourselves book, were overwhelmingly Jewish. The Boston Women's Health Collective, I think, was 50% plus Jewish. Obviously it would vary from city to city, to community to community. But what Rabbi Jane, I think what you're describing is something that we were seeing to some extent in feminist spaces generally. But what's important to note is the Jewishness of feminist space, particularly on the urban East Coast, and some other places where Jews were a significant part of the population. That feminist.
I think it was also true on college campuses as well. That not just, East Coast everywhere, but the isolated, even like college campuses like in Austin or Madison, still had a very high concentration of Jews and Jewish feminists and Jewish queers. I think there's been a lot written on what I was talking about who's likely to throw out their children and who won't, but the Jewish permission for deviance culturally. And so even though, and particularly as these lesbian, bisexual women started to have babies, that the whole issues, the language started to change. What we're talking about today about the whole issue of family, and that the extended Jewish family started to feel a lot better if you could show that that babies were going to come. However, in the gay male community, nearly the same time, just a little bit later now, as we get into the 80s, the issue of AIDS brought up family in an entirely different way.
Yeah, so men, as in the 70s, as some women and some lesbians in particular start having children through very much do-it-yourself technology. And by the way, why are they using do-it-yourself technology? Well, 3 reasons. One, because of the empowerment of these women's health groups and these women's health collectives, right? But also, remember, this is also the era of the Jewish catalog and the Whole Earth catalog, and a sort of a do-it-yourself mentality that's sort of a legacy of the 1960s counterculture. But also, if they wanted to actively try and use official medical assisted technology, it would not be allowed, right? Doctors were not going to help someone out of wedlock or someone who assertively and publicly identifies as a lesbian or a gay person to have a child. And for gay men, it would often be literally illegal. There were laws prohibiting, quote, single gay men. And because you couldn't marry, you were by definition single under the law, no matter if you had a partner or not. A single gay man could not adopt a child.
And there was,
Yes.
and similar to now, we're sort of seeing a resurgence of, in the Republican Party of setting back the odometer on the used car, and that we see a resurgence of this of the panic, the child sex panic, which is that that everybody in the Democratic Party are child pornographers, that a woman who's about to be a Supreme Court justice somehow is, a groomer, and that the whole issue of protecting the children, that was Anita Bryant's whole, save the children idea, which was that any single or, any gay man was, should be viewed as a child predator. And that,
and I was actually I was teaching, I teach a class on Holocaust and genocide. And in that class, I was talking about violence against sexual minorities and gender minorities. And we talked about the Save the Children campaign with Anita Bryant of the late 1970s, where Anita Bryant helped overturn what had recently been passed, was the Gay Civil Rights Ordinance in Miami-Dade County. And the success of that caused a wave of similar measures being overturned in cities across the country. But the symbolic value of that was in Florida in the 1970s, and linked to exactly this idea that gay people and gay men in particular are somehow either child predators who may sexually abuse or sexually molest children, and or in this sort of complicated way, people who need to recruit children, because otherwise there is no second generation of gay people. The gay people don't exist in and of themselves. They are recruited through some sort of nefarious network. And this is literally the language that's playing out in the same state, Florida, today, 40 years later, which is absolutely frightening. So we have this era where women are experimenting with do-it-yourself reproductive technology for very specific reasons. It's not just an accident. Men are still largely not able to have children really in any way, right? They don't have access to wombs, so they can't do it themselves. And there's no legal mechanism for doing it, right? So men are largely not having children.
Except it's not, not entirely, Greg, because a lot of times the friend that the lesbian couple would choose would be a gay man. I would say that would be, as often as not. And sometimes it would be like the brother or something like that, but often it would be a gay male friend. And in the Jewish community, I think that was particularly true. There was some desire, despite I would always counsel them not to use Jewish sperm because of Jewish legal reasons, and also let's diversify the Jewish gene pool. But it was common, I would say, as common as not, to choose a gay man to be, and then he would be the uncle. I mean, he would be the uncle, in that those men, sometimes those family structures weren't entirely stable and there would be conflict later, but often that gay man would be part of that child's life and, be sort of like a non-custodial parent or an uncle type of person. And I would say there were several dozen of that I knew of.
Yeah, and absolutely. Yeah, there are certainly the beginnings already in this era of, what I think, Jane, you were already beginning to allude to, of the queering of the notion of family, right? The queering of the notion of family had already begun by creating alternative visions of family altogether that focus on the idea of chosen family that isn't reproductively oriented, right? That's a sort of a core queering of family because it completely removes family from the idea that Norman Lamb, right, was asserting that family is about reproduction, sexuality is about reproduction. That is why these institutions and urges and instincts exist, right? So the sort of core queer impulse is to completely transform that and make family chosen. In the 70s, gradually there is another sort of phase 2 of queering, or a different type of queering of family, which is to accept the possibility of reproductive futurity, but to do it in different ways, right? To create different constellations of what family can or should look like by having the donor dad or the donor uncle, by having more complex relationships of people who feel a familial or parental commitment to a particular child or a particular familial constellation. And I think that's being largely driven by women, with sort of women at the core of that, and men in some ways playing a part in that, in those orbits, in those constellations, until we start getting into the mid to late 80s, where some men start to center themselves in that. Very rarely, it didn't happen much. An interesting example is former rabbi of Shar Zahav from many, many years ago in the late 70s and early 80s, Alan Bennett. His partner in the early and mid 80s, Steve Rutzer, was one of the first, again, quote unquote, single gay men, because he was not legally married to another man. So a single gay man, one of the first single gay men in California to legally adopt a child, I think in 1984, 85. And that was beginning to happen to some small extent. So there's—
and during the 80s, a lot of what was driving that was the AIDS crisis, was the epidemic, the plague, and the need, the absolute core need to change lifestyles. And for many gay men, absolutely needed family constellations. And the acceptance, I think, of mainstream Judaism to realize that it needed to be there for gay men in ways that it had totally failed. And so I think that drove the bonds so much closer during the 80s of, that what sort of Gregg and I have been talking about, in almost a divided gay community where there would be gay and lesbian. And in the 70s, it was really hard to see places where men, gay men and lesbian women would come together in any kind of, seriously shared endeavor. And in the 80s, that changed. And it changes because, I think primarily because of AIDS, but other things too. And that, the first, exciting that the women are getting a little older, the baby boomers, who are the core of the lesbian feminist movement in the 70s, are, finding a little bit of maturity. Their children need some space now that these, tukey baster babies need some help. The boy babies, it's an irony of artificial insemination or donor insemination, that it tends to bring up more boys than girls because of just certain biological context. And so these boys needed, I think a lot of particularly Jewish lesbians felt that the boys needed male role models, and there was a search for male role models. And all of those things came together to bring about a more familial Jewish queer community in the 80s.
Right. So as an example, at Congregation Sha'ar Zahav in San Francisco, which Rabbi Jane served as rabbi in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, and that I was a member of, and my late husband, Dr. David Schneer, was the director of education there from 1997. So we both have a very deep connection to that community. Began offering, at Sha'ar Zahav, began offering childcare at high holiday services, for example, as early as 1985. Exactly this sort of recognition that there are children growing up, there are children emerging in the community. So childcare was being offered there by the Women's Havurah. So let's, gender, childcare, like even the queer synagogues were sometimes doing that. By 1986, Sha'ar Zahav had its first congregational meeting on supporting families. And by 1987, they were counting 23 families with children in the congregation, so that by 1988, they recognized the need to actually create a school. By 1988, there were 45 children in that synagogue alone. And there's a very lovely, cute story from 1988 as well, that Evan Kulik, the son of lesbian moms, was age 6.5 in 1988, and he became a full member of Sha'ar Zahav after agreeing to pay 1% of his allowance and membership dues. So there's this gradual sort of emergence of family into the congregation in the way that Rabbi James is describing, and the congregation's having to respond to figure out how do we integrate these families in these communities. And so by September 1988, this sort of milestone moment, Shar Zahav begins Kadimo, the name for their Hebrew school. Kadimo is the Hebrew word that literally means forward, but more colloquially means kind of like, come on, let's go. And it started with just 10 kids, but gradually grew and grew and grew. But it was the first LGBT Jewish school in the world. Eventually, other gay congregations in LA first, and then in New York and other cities began doing this as well. But for many 5, 10, 15 years later, so Shar Zahav was definitely the first. And what's most fascinating about this process is the first director of the school and the first teacher, the first person who was really bringing it to life, was a straight identified woman, a heterosexual identified woman, Phyllis Mincer. So Phyllis was running the world's first queer Jewish religious school. Talk about sort of queering expectations and standards that so if queer synagogues are sort of bringing LGBT possibility and queering normative Judaism, sometimes these queer synagogues are in turn queering queer space by bringing in straight identified people in new and interesting ways that help clarify that queer insights in queering of community are a sort of value for all of us, right? That we all benefit from that, no matter whether we identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, genderqueer, or straight. Like, we all learn from, benefit, and can contribute to the queering of Jewish communal space and the queering of Jewish tradition that makes a more inclusive world and a more inclusive community for everyone, right? And Phyllis absolutely took that on.
Phyllis was wonderful. I think, though, that I do want to say there's sort of periods of this, of straight integration, because in the early period, there weren't qualified. I mean, Phyllis was an amazingly qualified educator. She had a long track record of, spent a lifetime in Jewish education. And so she completely was able to build a school from scratch, in her sleep practically, because she was so qualified. And there wasn't anybody who was out and gay who was in that, who could do that. Similarly for Bet Haim Hadashim, the gay synagogue in Los Angeles, their first rabbi was straight. And it was just because there just weren't gay rabbis out at that point. There were gay rabbis, of course, but it was a career bust to be out. So you weren't quite ready to do that. As Kadima started, also in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, and I believe in New York, they did have bar bat mitzvah programs. So they didn't have quite the kids in the school yet, what San Francisco had, which was an integrated community with children. There were still these children who were sort of hovering around the edges of the integrated community, and bar bat mitzvah was a priority. Again, having to do with Jewish family, Jewish values, education. So it's a priority for straight families still. Like, I can't tell you how many families show up with a 12-year-old kid and say, let's give them a year's worth of Jewish education and call them to the bima. And it was for gay families too. And so if there was a 12-year-old kid hovering around, there had to be a way to bring them to Torah.
So as each of these congregations and on slightly different timeframes began finding ways to institutionalize the fact of this increasingly more diverse queer Jewish space, there was some tension. And so going back to this era of the expectation, the assumption that gay and lesbian people by definition were people who did not have children, right? And we talked before about how that was both an assumption that was external, that was the assumption that straight identified leaders might make, but also very much internalized by a lot of queer people for many, many years, for decades. And so that when they began forming Jewish queer space, they did it on their own terms, with the understanding that they were creating effectively a new kind of Jewish space, right? If we understand most synagogues, most normative synagogues, to be very family-oriented, they were doing not that, right? They were creating a new model of what Jewish space could look like, a new model of what a synagogue could look like, one that was not centered around children, one that wasn't centered around family, one where they could expressly be free from that societal and communal pressure to procreate. So some of them had come to terms with not having children, and felt some loss, some sadness about that. Others had seen that as sort of a political understanding of that's what queer people do. We don't have children, so it was part of a sort of a political choice. Others had just sort of hidden and buried down this pressure that they had always felt as younger people from their families and their community, and they had pushed that away, and they had succeeded in creating an alternative institution where that pressure didn't surface, and they were able to sort of ignore it for a long time, and it wasn't there. When these communities began integrating children and families into the space, that brought up these issues in very meaningful and sometimes very powerful and traumatic ways for some people. People who had come to terms with a sense of loss of that they weren't going to have children, they weren't going to produce grandchildren for their parents, were now at an age where that wasn't really even a choice that they could make anymore. And now the space that they had come to understand as the safe space where they could fully be themselves was now putting that front and center again. And that was really, really hard, particularly for an older generation of gay men, but some lesbians as well. There were some lesbians who were, that being lesbian meant I'm not having children. And so it was not by any means a gendered thing, just more men were having this response than women.
Yeah, it wasn't gendered, but it was a generational. And that it was a very big generational divide between a generation that just had accepted it wasn't possible and a generation that increasingly thought that it was and wanted it. There was also the tension of sexuality and the presence of sexuality in the gay community. Of course, there's really, in a certain way, no more sex in the gay community than there is among straight people, right? That heterosexual is a form of sexual. And so, the sexualization of gay life, I want to sort of push back around that idea that it's all about sex. That said, there is a kind of, there are different norms, and there are just different sexual norms in the queer community than there are in the mainstream world. And sex there's more sex positivity, openness about sexuality, and a belief that, which is, is in harmony with Judaism, basically, that sex is a good thing. And that, education, openness are a good thing. But sometimes that did really come to a head because so for example, I remember one Purim where it had been a custom in this community for there to be a Queen Esther gay male drag and strip show. And which was, accompanied by many catcalls, and, it was a very sexualized and fun, extremely fun thing, but not really G-rated. And so, when there got to be a feeling of like, oh, we're having a Purim celebration that absolutely excludes children, and how do we work that out in the same space? Should we have an early service for the children and a late service, which is the strip show? Should we relegate the children to a carnival on Sunday? It was a sort of a very unbelievably tense and difficult conversation that was filled with other assumption, other things that were being symbolized and discussed, agendas that were deep down, as Gregg said, deep psychological agendas.
And gradually, there's this plays out that some people leave these spaces, right? Some of the older members of some of these communities actually left in that era. Some of them returned later, but some did not. This was just no longer the space they thought they had created, and it was no longer working for them. But it was also drawing in new people, right? So in addition to these various ways in which queer people are finding new ways to have families for themselves and this do-it-yourself tradition, two other things are starting to change. One is increasing numbers of straight identified folks are joining these synagogues because they see them expressly as inclusive, open, and welcoming spaces, and they want that for themselves and for their families. So there's, actually, I remember at Shar Zahav, we avoided actually referring to them as straight couples, we just refer to them as mixed gender couples, to not necessarily be making assumptions about what the sexual or gender identities of those individuals might be, right? So, increasing numbers of mixed gender couples. There's also an interesting poll of single women who would sometimes join LGBT synagogues because they knew it was a place where they were less likely to get that "have I got a nice Jewish doctor for you" pressure of meeting someone and dating someone. So there's this interesting dynamic of these spaces becoming more and more diverse at precisely the moment that families and the diversity of families is growing.
And Greg, so that's what I was going to say to you earlier about the leadership and how sort of diversity comes in waves of sexual orientation diversity and gender diversity, because in the earliest wave, a number of the professionals are heterosexual because there aren't professionals out. In the later wave, what happens is that the professionals start to become, it is okay for gay people to be out and in leadership positions, and that these become actually coveted leadership positions for people, and that there's a lot of, they can do a lot with them. And then the people in the pews start to become, or in the community start to become, more diverse. And this particularly is true in the schools. By this time, which we're now talking sort of the 90s, in Atlanta, in the synagogue their school is in the 90s was 50% children of mixed gender couples and 50% of children of gay identified couples or singles.
And then, this is also the era precisely, so we're now roughly to the early 90s that professional reproductive technology becomes more accessible to queer people. And, I see someone in chat who'd already mentioned that, at least in Canada, in this case, but I think that the time frame is fairly similar in the US, that it's really not until the early 90s that medical professionals might start providing reproductive technology services to lesbian and gay couples, offering, artificial insemination, offering surrogacy, adoptions becoming more and more available, although still illegal in many parts of the US. So that there's this gradual shift in who can create families, which is also helping to, again, expand the realm or the range of what queer families can look like, because you start now having more gay and bisexual men who are having queer families of choice. If there were maybe a handful of pioneers or other men who had been maybe the donor uncle and maybe less in the center of the family, but part of the family structure, you now have families being created entirely by men, which is another shift in the dynamic of what queer families start to look like. Right.
But entirely by men, and then also many that are mixed gender family parental collections that are still queer and gay. So that I remember when I was Rabbi Charzahov, one of my favorite families was had two children and 6 parents. And all of the parents were, they weren't all legal parents because you couldn't then, but they were all, seriously connected to these children. None of them were like uncle parents or anything like that. They lived in the same household, all 6 of them. They had all been with each other in various different ways in the past. They were all part of these children's life from birth. And it just turned out the 2 genetic parents were not Jewish, but the culturally most, the ones that really cared, that were the 3 Jewish parents who insisted that these kids be raised Jewish and have Jewish education. And it was a lovely, and the kids grew up and still have 6 parents. It all worked out. And it's still working out. And those 6 parents have, just recently a grandchild. So futurity does exist.
Right. So David Schneer, so my late husband, when he was at Charzahov, he wrote an essay about this in Queer Jews, this book that he and Karen Aviv did 20 years ago, where he was talking about his experience running the school at Shar Zahab and having to use, throughout, there had been a Bureau of Jewish Education provided family tree project that they attempted to use and almost instantly recognized no way could this possibly work. And they created these beautiful family constellations where they encouraged the children to describe the families how they thought they work. So some described them as constellations, some as networks, some as a web with the child in the center of the web, right? But that these very diverse family structures, and a 6-parent family is obviously one of the more creative, but by no means the only, right? So there's families where there are the donor uncles that we've mentioned. There are families with multiple co-parents. There are families with previous partners who are still part of the familial structure, right? So mom's ex and mom's ex's ex, right? They're all part of the family constellation. And these sorts of constellations sort of challenge the expectations that we have of what normative family look like. I want to turn to something else that's a little bit more external to the inside of these queer communities and these queer congregations in particular. And by the way, it wasn't only in gay synagogues, it was happening elsewhere, but are the sort of the richness of the sheer numbers where you could bring people together in a critical mass would often happen at a queer synagogue. But two interesting things happening externally in the broader Jewish landscape. One is the power of Jewish grandparents, the simplest way to describe it. Jewish parents and grandparents of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender kids who want to have grandkids. And so they become, as we already discussed, Jews, for a variety of reasons, are often less likely to reject their queer children, even in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when, say, Catholic, very devout Catholic families or very devout evangelical families might sometimes do that. It was, could happen in the Jewish world, but it was relatively rare. That there was also still this key Jewish imperative towards family that we had already seen, being discussed by Norman Lamb vis-a-vis gay people. And so once it became clear that, you could in fact have children, well, where's my children, right? So parents started pushing this, in particular through networks such as PFLAG, Parents, Friends of Lesbians and Gays, that they're not just talking about this with their children one-on-one, the calls from mom, we all know that kind of pressure, but they're also actually showing up in institutional spaces where they're, say, for example, speaking on a panel for PFLAG at their synagogue or at the JCC, or meeting with the rabbi, or meeting with other Jewish communal leaders and advocating for Jewish communities to be more inclusive and to create space for queer Jewish families. Right? So there's this external pressure happening at the same time that these communities are also creatively reimagining family internally. And it also creates this interesting thing among leaders of the national movements, particularly the Reform and Reconstructionist movements, who start to notice, because of these growing families and because of the growing gay synagogue movement, which reached its peak in the late 80s, early 90s, they start to see untapped market potential, right? We've always been worried about declining numbers in our communities and our congregations. Here's a bunch of Jews who no one is paying attention to. Let's focus on that. I actually had conversations with national leaders of the Reform movement where they were very clear about that language, that they were, saw an untapped market and wanted to make sure they weren't missing some Jews who were ready and willing to engage, right? So there are these, these external forces as well that are sort of, once the idea of a Gayby Boom becomes clear and visible in public, that are sort of swooping in and supporting that or pressuring that, kind of depending on your perspective, right? It's a double-edged sword. It gets back again at some of these questions of that societal pressure, which some LGBTQ people might resist for political reasons, for emotional reasons, for personal reasons of a wide range. So it's a double-edged sword, both positive and negative, depending on the micro details.
And then by the late 90s and early 2000s, we start to see the emergence of a identifiable trans Jewish population that is, self-identified and advocating for its needs. And many of those trans Jews already have children and bring the children into the community with them. Others have children. We start to see more trans men having children, and the perceptual openness that then brings about, where we start to talk about pregnant people as opposed to pregnant women, and understand that we again are queering the whole idea of reproduction, both in terms of sexual orientation, but also in terms of gender identity. And interestingly, perhaps, coming to more modern times, perhaps the most intimate and wide-ranging television show about Jews ever was Transparent, which is a trans Jewish family that also had numerous queer members in one way or another, and that was deeply, deeply identified as Jewish and also queer.
So we are at our about 4 to 5 minute mark. So if folks have questions, there's been some interesting comments in the chat, but if other folks have questions they want to have us address or things they want to bring up, please put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we can talk about those. So while we're waiting on that, did you, Rabbi Jane, also want to talk about your work around queer responding?
That was just where I was going. So about maybe 10 years ago, I started wondering to myself, well, all these children, what happened to them? And so maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, I put out a call online into all my friends to see if I could dig up people who had been raised in Jewish synagogues, who had attended a religious school in a Jew, or had a bar mitzvah training in a Jewish synagogue. Because I was actually interested in a gay Jew. Yeah, I'm sorry, a gay synagogue, right? All synagogues are Jewish, more or less. And I found about 20 who were willing to talk to me from a wide geographical range, I was pleased to say. And the thing that was most interesting to me was that they were 20 college age. I wanted them above 18. So they were college and grad school, most of them. And I think if you just grabbed up 20 Jews from the age of 18 to maybe 20, I think my oldest was 28, that you would just find a variety of affiliation. All of these, every single one of them was affiliated, and in Jewish identified and affiliated to some Jewish organization, which I thought was astounding. Also, what was very interesting to me is that most of them were unwilling to tell me their sexual orientation. That most of them would say something like, well, I don't like boxes, I don't like labels, who knows what I am really. And they were, the issue of gender identity, I think maybe it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago, because the issue of gender identity was not as prominent as it would be now. And mostly what I asked them is, do you consider yourself part of the Jewish gay community? Because without regard to whatever your sexual orientation is, whether you'll tell me it or not. And again, virtually all of them, maybe one exception, but say 19 out of 20 said to me that they thought of themselves as second generation gay Jews without regard to their orientation, and that they went back to their home communities and felt that those were a place where that was home. So I thought, again, this issue of futurity, Gregg, is that as we often sort of talk about what is post-gay, is there such a thing as post-gay? And if there is, a diverse queering of being of sexual orientation, so that it means something broader than that, but that as well, I think we'll see it in that generation.
When I think actually what I like also about that is it feels like that's a sort of a mingling together of the idea of chosen family and biological family, right? So it's a queer bringing, like if initially these were two different queer paths, again, the queer lens is to bring them back together and reintegrate them in an interesting way. That kids who are emerging through some biological connection to queer parenthood also feel a chosen connection to queer community, which I think is, that they see as intimate and home and familial, which I think is beautiful.